Hello everyone, and welcome back to Aliens After Dark. Every night on this channel, I share alien and UFO encounter stories, told softly, to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from tonight. Now, get comfortable. Let your eyes close if they want to, and let's begin. It was sitting on the one piece of that mountain I had said out loud by mistake. 2 nights before. A digit in the wrong place, corrected in about 4 seconds, and forgotten the way you forget any small thing that costs you nothing. My name's Wes Dunbar. I was 34 that spring, an air controller attached to a rifle company, which means my whole job was the sky over one valley. What is in it? What is coming into it? What it is allowed to do? I had been doing that job for 9 years by then, and I had been looking up a lot longer than that. The post was called Kestrel. It sat on the shoulder of a ridge at about 6,000 feet, a quarter mile of sandbag and wires strung along ground too steep for machines. Everything up there was carried up or dug by hand, mostly at night, mostly by men who were already tired. 2 guard positions, a mortar pit that never fired the whole time I was there, a plywood hut with the radios in it, and a burn barrel, and a mule track going down to the road. Below us, there was a river the color of wet cement. Above us, the mountains went up in steps and did not stop. You would look at them in the morning and find a new one you had not noticed because the light had moved. I want to be clear about something before I get into it. Most of what happened at that post was nothing. That is what nobody tells you. It was weather and mail and the same 9 conversations and the specific boredom of watching a piece of ground you have already memorized. I knew the sky, though. That was mine. I could tell you what was up there by the sound of it at night through canvas, with my eyes closed. It was a party trick for a while. The guys would wake me up on purpose to see if I could do it half asleep, and I could most of the time. Twin turboprop, single rotor, heavy. That is a jet, and it is not ours, and it is very high. I learned it the way you learn anything, which is from someone who loved it first. My uncle used to take me out to the county airport when I was small, and we would sit on the hood of his truck at the end of the fence line, and he would name things as they came in. He would say the name before you could see the shape. I thought that was the greatest thing a person could do. So that is who was standing on that ridge. I want that understood because of what comes later. There was a card taped to the plywood in the north guard position. A range card, we called it, though this one was more of a drawing. Somebody before us had sketched the whole valley across a piece of paper in faded pen, every landmark on the far side, with the distance to each one written under it. The bend in the river, the stone wall, a rock formation somebody had labeled the boot, because it looked like a boot if you had been up there long enough. And there was one more thing on that card, near the top right, in the same faded pen, a shape drawn with a soft line, and under it, saddle ? 2300. Whoever drew it was not sure what he was looking at. He had put a question mark on a mountain. We used to laugh about that. Somebody would come off shift and say the boot was in its usual place, and the saddle was still undecided. I read grids aloud twice. That is the procedure. You say a set of numbers, and then you say them again, because a digit in the wrong place is the whole difference between one piece of ground and another. Everybody who does my job does it. You do it so many times that you stop hearing yourself do it. That is the mistake I opened with. A digit off, a piece of mountain with nothing on it. Ochoa heard it before I did and gave it back to me, and I said it again correctly, and that was the end of it. I would not have remembered it at all except for what I am going to tell you. The weather had us closed for 40 hours. That matters more than it sounds like it should. No aircraft in or out means no mail, no fresh food, no rotation, no anything. It gets very quiet in a way that has nothing to do with sound. Men get short with each other over card games. Somebody smokes his last cigarette and does not mention it. It was also cold. People do not expect that. It was hot enough at 2 in the afternoon to make you stupid, and then the sun would go behind the ridge and the temperature would fall off a cliff, and by 3 in the morning you could see your breath and feel the cold in the fillings of your teeth. You slept in everything you owned. You woke up with your hands curled. There was a wind-up there that came in at dusk and quit around midnight. Not roughly at midnight near enough that you could set a watch by it, like a shift change. When it went, you noticed. The canvas stopped moving, and the whole ridge got still. And for the first minute, you always thought something was wrong before you remembered that this was the normal part. That night, the wind quit, and I felt the hum. I want to be careful here, because this is the part where people start filling in words for me. I did not hear it first. I felt it in my sternum, low, like standing near a truck that is idling on the other side of a wall. And then, when I did hear it, it had no signature. There was no blade slap, no turbine whine, no propeller beat. There was no engine in it at all. It was one flat tone with nothing underneath, and it was already there, the way a light is already on when you walk into a room. The dogs in the village below stopped. All of them in about a second, which is not how dogs work. Dogs trail off. These went out like a switch. Then the kettle stopped ringing. The Afghan army post was 40 meters down the slope from us, and they had a kettle with a dented lid that never sat flat, and it clicked all night against the rim. It was one of those sounds you stop registering until it goes. I turned to say something to Ochoa, and he was already looking. So was Lund, who narrated everything he did out loud to stay awake, and who was not saying anything. Down the slope, the men at the other post were standing at their wall, facing the same way we were. Nobody had called out. There had been no order, no shout, no radio. 2 posts of men, in the dark, all pointed the same direction like iron filings. The light was sitting at the saddle. Not near it. At it. On the piece of the far ridge that had a question mark on our range card, at about 2,300 meters, which happened to be very close to the grid I had misread aloud 2 nights before, and corrected and forgotten. I have gone around and around on that. I have decided it means nothing. I would like to say that in a way that sounds convincing. It was white, and it did not flicker, and it had no shape I could give you. If you have ever tried to look at a welding arc through a doorway, you know what I mean. Your eye keeps saying it is round and then keeps failing to prove it. And while I was looking at it, the mountain behind it went away. That is the best I can do. The ridgeline that ran up and to the right of it was there, and then it was not, and the sky went straight down to where the ridge should have been, and then it was back. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Nobody said anything about it at the time. 2 weeks later, Lund said, without any preamble, on a different subject entirely, that the mountain had gone, and I said yes. And that was the whole conversation. The thing I keep coming back to is that there was no sound from it. Not a quiet sound, none. Everything in that valley had a sound. At 2,300 meters on a still night, I could hear a goat move on scree. I could hear the river. I could hear a truck downshift 11 kilometers away on the road and know which truck it was. And here was something sitting on the far ridge putting out that much light, and the air between us was carrying nothing. Zemarai came up to our wall. He was the Afghan sergeant, a heavy, patient man in his 40s who'd been fighting in one uniform or another since he was 19. He stood with us and looked at it for maybe 2 minutes. Then he made a small noise in his throat and went back down the slope, and I heard him relight the burner under the kettle. He did not run. He did not explain. He put the water back on. Then it came down the ridge. It did not descend. It moved down the slope of the far ridge line, and then, in a way I did not see happen, it was on our side of the valley, on the near slope below us. And it came up toward the wire at a walking pace, not a hover, not a drift, a pace, the pace of a man who is not in a hurry and is not tired. And it stopped and started the way a man does. It would move about 5 meters and stop. 5 meters and stop. 5 meters and stop. That is dispersion. That is the spacing men are taught to keep when they move at night, so that one thing cannot get all of them. Whatever was coming up that hill was moving in the intervals of a foot patrol, and it was one light and it was alone. Then it dropped behind the near ridge and was gone. 11 minutes. Ochoa timed it, which tells you what kind of person Ochoa is. Somebody said it was illumination from the post at the other end of the valley. That is a reasonable thing to say. Illum is a flare on a parachute. It drifts and swings and throws shadows around, and this had not done any of those things, but a man will say a reasonable thing at a moment like that and everyone will help him. I got on the radio and asked the other post if they had fired Illum. They had not. They had not fired anything for a week and a half, and the man on the other end wanted to know why I was asking, and I said no reason, and he let it go the way you let things go on a radio. We laughed about it for a while anyway. Somebody did a bit about the boot rock hiring a lawyer. It was funny. We were fine. I want to include that part because everybody leaves it out. There is a stretch in the middle of these things where you are just a bunch of guys on a hill making each other laugh, and it is the best you feel all week. Then I noticed where I was standing. I was at the wire, not in the guard position. At the wire, out in the open on the north side, and so was every other man on that post. All of us. In a line, shoulder to shoulder along the front edge of that hill in the dark, facing out. The way you stand for a formation nobody told you was happening. I do not remember the walk. I want to be honest about that because it is the thing that gets me, more than the rest of it. 22 men do not all decide to stand in a line. There is no version of that where somebody does not say, "Let's go look." Nobody said it. I have asked 2 of them since. Neither of them remembers deciding either, and both of them remember exactly where they were standing. And it came back up over the lip of the near slope, close, maybe 60 meters out and a little below us, so that the light was coming at us more or less level. It moved along the line of us, slowly, from the right end to the left, not scanning, nothing sweeping about it, no beam. It simply went along the front of us at the pace a man walks when he is looking at faces in a rank. It got to me, and it kept going, and it got to the end, and it stopped there for a while. Nobody made a sound. There was nothing to hear anyway. And I stood there with my hands at my sides and had the clearest thought I have ever had in my life, which was that I was being counted. I do not know how long. I have said 4 minutes. I have said 20. Ochoa, who times things, did not time this one. Then it was above the far side of the valley again, small. And then it was not there. And the wind came back even though the wind had already quit for the night. And the dogs started up in the village, and the kettle started clicking against the rim. And Lund said something out loud about his own hands, and did not finish the sentence. Here is the part I do not tell people. While it was in front of us, on the slope below the wire, the loose gravel was running uphill. It was a stone slope, the kind that shifts if you look at it, and the small stuff, the fine broken stone, was moving up it, steadily, like a spillway in reverse. I watched it do that for as long as the thing was in front of us, and then I did not look at it again, we did not report it. I want to be straight about that. There is no line on any form for a light that walks. Ochoa put in the log that there was an unidentified light source at the far ridge for approximately 50 minutes and no action was taken. That is true. That is all of it that is true in the way a log needs things to be true. At first light, I went and put my hand on the sandbags on the north face of the position, the shaded ones, the ones that are cold at dawn every single morning up there, and they were warm. Not hot, warm, like a wall that has had the sun on it for an hour. And I walked around to the south face where the sun was actually coming, and those were cold. I stood there for a while with a hand on each, and then I went and made coffee, because it was my turn. The burn barrel smelled like kerosene and coffee grounds that morning, the way it did every morning. That is the detail I have kept the longest, which seems like a waste. Of everything that happened on that hill, the thing my head hands back to me first is a smell I did not even like. I still read terrain. That is the thing my wife notices. On a highway, out an airplane window, in a parking lot with a hill behind it, I am counting features and naming them and putting distances on them, and I do not know how to stop, and I do not particularly want to. I have looked at every map of that valley I can get my hands on. Satellite, contour, the old surveys, the tourist ones from before, all of it. I have found the boot. I have found the bend and the wall. The saddle is not on any of them. Maybe I am reading the maps wrong. Maps are drawn by people, and people leave things out. And a man who wants to find something in a picture will find it. That is probably all it is. But I was the one on that hill whose whole job was knowing what is in the sky. And I stood in a line I do not remember joining, and something went along the front of us the way you walk a rank, and every man there led it. The old men had a name for it, and the name was older than the base, and older than the road the base was built to protect. My name is Farhad Amini. I was 41 that autumn, working as a linguist, which is a word the Army uses for a man who sits between two conversations and belongs to neither of them. I was born in Kabul. I was raised in Fremont, California, from the age of 6. I have 2 vocabularies, and I move between them without thinking. And that is the entire skill, and it took me my whole life to acquire. By then, I had been doing that work for 11 years. I want to say something about that, because it matters for the rest. You learn, after a while, to sort what people tell you. Somebody says a thing, and within 2 sentences you know whether it is gossip, or a warning, or a complaint with a story wrapped around it, or a joke at the expense of a neighbor. That is most of the job. Not the words, the category. I know what people sound like when they are inventing. It has a particular music to it. It leans forward. I wore a badge on a lanyard because I was required to. It had my photograph on it and a number, and it flipped around backward 20 times a day. And I was forever turning it face out again with 2 fingers while I was in the middle of a sentence. Nobody in that valley ever looked at it. It was for our side. It told our side which kind of person I was, and there were only 2 kinds available, and neither of them was quite me. That autumn, I was at a district center in the east, in a valley with poplars planted in long lines along the irrigation ditches by somebody's grandfather. The leaves were going yellow. There was wood smoke in the evenings, and the smell of dust that has finally been rained on, which is the best smell there is, and I will not be argued out of it. We sat on the roof most evenings. There was a low parapet and plastic chairs, and a carpet they brought up whenever there were guests, and green tea, and a bowl of hard candy that was refilled from a bag nobody ever saw. Below us, the district generator ticked away. Beyond the compound there was a bald hill, standing out in front of the ridge behind it, the way a knuckle stands out from a hand. I kept a notebook of names, This was my own project. Nothing to do with anybody's mission. The maps we carried gave every hill a number, and a number tells you nothing. The people who lived there had names for all of it, and a name will often tell you what a place has done to people. A hill called the place of the two brothers. A hill called where the snow stays. You learn a great deal that way. That week, I wrote down a new one from Baba Nazir, who was somewhere past 70 and had the whole valley's memory in him. The name, more or less, meant where the lamp sits. He said it the way you mention a bad road, not as a wonder, as a nuisance. We were talking about grazing, and the boys who take the goats up, and he said the ones who go past a certain point in the evening will have trouble because of the lamp, and then he moved on to the price of diesel. I asked him what he meant, and he looked at me the way you look at a nephew who has been abroad too long, and he said, the lamp. It sits there. It goes along the water sometimes. And he shrugged with only one shoulder. The younger men at the district center changed the subject. Not out of fear, out of embarrassment. The way you change the subject about a relative who is difficult. One of them made a face at me that meant, the old man is doing the old man thing. Please do not write it down. I wrote it down. Later that same evening, the district clerk, a careful man in his 30s who wore a very clean shirt every day of his life, came and sat beside me and said, in the tone of someone doing me a kindness, that the old people say a great many things. I agreed with him. He seemed relieved. Then he sat there for another minute and did not leave, and eventually he said that his father had also mentioned the lamp once, a long time ago, and that his father was not an old-fashioned man. Then he took his cup and went downstairs. That is the shape of it, all through that valley. Nobody wanted to be the person who said it plainly, but if you sat still long enough and did not react and let the tea come around again, everyone would eventually give you their one sentence and then leave. There was a lieutenant with us, a man named Kearns, 24 years old and decent all the way through, and completely out of his depth in a way I spent that whole tour quietly protecting him from. He was learning the etiquette of the third cup of tea, which is that you should not stand up during it. He was doing well. The evening it happened, the goats came down on their own. I noticed it because Baba Nazir noticed it, and I had learned to watch what he watched. There were maybe 60 animals on the lower slope of that bald hill, and no boy with them that I could see, and they came down off it in one movement, all in the same direction, without hurrying and without scattering. Just down, like water finding the low part. The generator kept ticking. The tea came around again, and then there was light along the ditch line. It came from the direction of the hill, following the line of the irrigation ditch and the poplars beside it, at about the height of the trees. It was the size of, I want to say, a car, if a car had no edges. It moved at the speed of a man on a bicycle. It was white, and there was a warmth at the middle of it, the color of a lamp in a window in a country where they still use oil. The roof got bright enough to read by. I remember thinking that in exactly those words, because I had my notebook open on my knee, and I could see the writing on the page in front of me. My own handwriting, quite clear. That is the thing my mind chose to record. And I could not hear the generator. It was directly below us. It had been the loudest thing on that roof for 2 months. A diesel with a bad mount that shook the whole west wall, and while that light was on the ditch line, the roof was silent. I could hear my own swallow. I could not hear the machine 10 meters under my feet. Baba Nazir did not look up. I want to be very precise about this because it is the part that changed how I think. He was not pretending. I have watched people pretend. He poured the tea, and he pushed the candy bowl an inch toward me, which is a thing he did when he wanted me to eat something, and he asked me a question about my mother's health. and then he waited for the answer. So I answered him. My mother's knee was bad, he said his was worse. The light went behind the hill. For a few minutes afterward, it was simply a nice evening on a roof. Kearns made a joke about drones, and the elders laughed politely, which is a specific laugh, and I knew what it meant, and did not translate it for him. Somebody's radio in another room was playing a call-in program about a wedding. The tea came around a fourth time, which is generous. I have thought a great deal since about how I would have translated Nazir's sentence if anyone had asked me to that night on the spot. It is harder than it sounds. In his language, the thing he said carried no fear in it at all. None. It had the weight of a man saying the well water is bad in that part of the village. If I had put it into English as it stood, an American would have heard a joke, because we do not have a register for a calm statement about something impossible. And if I had put any pressure into it, any at all, an American would have heard a ghost story. So there was no honest translation available. That happens more than people think. Two languages will have the same word and not the same temperature, and the temperature is most of the meaning. Then it came back over the parapet. Close. Close enough that everything on that roof was lit from below as well as above, and the pattern of the carpet was suddenly completely legible, every knot of it, in a light that was coming up off the floor. My hands were lit from underneath. The chairs threw no shadow in any direction I could find, and I understood, in the plain way you understand that a room has someone else in it, that I was being read, not looked at. Read the way I read a page, top to bottom, at a pace that is comfortable for the reader and has nothing to do with the page. I did not move. Nobody on that roof moved except Baba Nazir, who put his cup down. Then the light was over the hill, and then it was small, and then the generator came back, and it was very loud, and everyone laughed at how loud it was. We sat for another hour. That is the part nobody believes. We talked about the diesel price and a dispute over a mill, and Kearns did well with the third cup, and at the end of it Baba Nazir took my hand in both of his and said good night and told me to write to my mother. Kearns asked me, on the way down the stairs, what that had been. He asked it lightly. He was giving me the option. I said I did not know, which was true, and he said, all right, and I heard my uncle in it, and I did not sleep much that night. I found the line in my notebook 8 days later. The page for that hill had one more line on it than I had written. It was in my handwriting. It was in Dari, which I write slowly and badly and only when I am concentrating. And it was Nazir's phrasing, his exact construction, not the wording I had chosen when I wrote the name down, because I had made a different choice on purpose and I remembered making it. I have looked at that page many times over the years. It is still my hand. I can see where the pen dragged. The candy in the bowl that night had gone soft, all of it, in the dish, and the thermos was cold, and it had been filled maybe 40 minutes before. My grandmother had a word for a light that moves at night on its own. I asked my uncle about it once, when I was maybe 19 and very sure of things, and I told him it was a superstition, and he said, all right. He said it in English. All right, Farhad. And he never brought it up again, and I have thought about that all right for 25 years. I still collect names for hills. I have a page for the county I live in now. There is a ridge behind my house, and its name on the map is a man's surname, and there is a creek named after a different man's surname, and a road named after a third. They are all somebody's family name. Not one of them is a warning. I have decided that is either a very good sign about this country or a very careless one, and most nights I could argue it either way. The tape on the truck in front of me lit up from the wrong side, and tape cannot do that, and I have had 16 years to think of a way around it. I'm D. Falk. Deidre, but nobody has called me that since my mother. I was 29, a transport sergeant out of Dayton, and that winter I was running night resupply on a switchback road that went up the side of a mountain to a couple of posts that could not be reached any other way. I am not a spooky person. I want to say that once and then not keep saying it, because people who keep saying it are trying to convince themselves. Let me tell you about the road, because the road is half of this. One lane. Cut into the hillside, with a rock wall on your left going up and nothing at all on your right going down. Gravel over frozen ruts in the winter, and the ruts would thaw around 10 in the morning and refreeze at 4 in the afternoon. So the road you came up on was never the road you went down on. There were 7 switchbacks with names, and one bridge with a timber deck that everybody hated, and a place near the top where you could see the lights of a town 40 kilometers off on a clear night and feel very far from everything. The bridge was the thing everybody thought about all day. It was a timber deck, and you crossed it one truck at a time, and the boards talked under you the whole way across. You would get up on it, and the sound would change from gravel to wood, and your shoulders would come up around your ears, and then you would be over it, and you would let out a breath you had been holding since the last switchback. Everyone did that. Nobody admitted it. We were supposed to keep 200 meters between trucks. Nobody keeps 200 meters. In the dark, on a road that bends every 400, 200 means you cannot see the truck ahead of you at all, and there is nothing on this earth lonelier than that. So we ran about 80 and lied about it, and every convoy in that country ran about 80 and lied about it. We ran it at night, because that was when we ran it. Blackout drive when we could, headlights on when the ice made blackout stupid, which was most of that winter. My truck was number 3 in a column of 7. Ice on the inside of the windshield, because the heater burned dust and did nothing for the glass. A piece of plywood on the seat so my eye line cleared the wheel, and I am not embarrassed about the plywood. Everybody short had one. Grease pencil numbers on every windshield so you could tell each other apart in the mirrors. A pallet of bottled water, a pallet of mail, and one pallet of something nobody ever identified and nobody ever asked about. A cold cab with a hot heater core is its own particular misery. Your shins cook and your hands never warm up, and the windshield fogs at the edges and freezes there, and you scrape at it with a gloved thumb every 20 minutes for 4 hours. Puckett sang. He had a habit of keying the radio without meaning to, so you would get about a bar and a half of something before he let go, and then 11 minutes of nothing, and then another bar and a half. He was terrible. He's a fire captain now, and I still hear from him at Christmas, and neither of us has ever brought up that night in 16 years. We had an Afghan jingle truck with us that run, a beautiful old thing hung with chains and painted every color there is, and its driver, who I never learned the name of, and who drove that road better than any of us. Now, cat eyes. That is the reflective tape on the back of every vehicle, and if you have never driven at night in a column, you would not know how much of your life it is. 2 strips, low, and you follow them. All night. You watch the tape ahead of you, and you keep the same amount of black between you and it. And that is the whole job. Here is the thing about reflective tape. It does not glow. There is nothing in it that makes light. It has thousands of tiny corners in it, and a corner sends light back exactly the way the light came in, which means it is only bright to a person standing where the light is standing. My headlights, my eyes, right behind them. That is why it works. If a light comes at that tape from the side or from behind it, I see nothing. It is just gray tape. You could put a floodlight on the shoulder of the road and shine it across that tape from 10 feet away, and I, sitting behind it, would see nothing at all. Remember that. We were maybe 2/3 up, past the bridge, in the long straight stretch before the 4th switchback, and the sound changed. That is the first thing. Not a noise. The engine noise went flat. Same volume. I want to be exact, it did not get quieter, but the depth went out of it like the sound was happening in a smaller room. It is what a car sounds like when you drive into a parking garage, except we were on the open side of a mountain with nothing over us for 100 miles. Then the dust hung. Every truck on that road lifts dust, and the dust drifts always, because there is always wind on that hillside. You can hear it on the mirror arms. My dust came up and stayed. It sat in the air behind me in my mirrors like something in a glass of water, and I could still hear the wind. Then Truck 4 lit up. Truck 4 was ahead of me. Its cat eyes came on bright and even, brighter than I had ever seen them. Both strips, the whole width of the tailgate, so clean I could read the stencil beside them, and my headlights were pointed straight at them. So, that is not the wrong side, you would say. That is the right side. Except that tape only does that for the light in the eye at the same place, and mine had been in that same place for 4 hours, and the tape had never looked like that. And when I say bright, I mean it was throwing a shadow off the strap end hanging beside it. Tape does not throw shadows. Tape gives your own light back to you. It cannot make a shadow, because there is nothing behind it doing the lighting. There was something behind it doing the lighting. I got about that far in my head, and then the column stopped. Nobody called a halt on the radio. Truck 1 just stopped, and we all stopped. And after a few seconds, every driver and every gunner got out and stood on that road. You have to understand that this is the last thing any of us would do. Halted vehicles on a one-lane mountain road at night, everyone dismounted, standing around in the open like a family looking at a flat tire. It was against every rule we had and every instinct any of us had earned, and not one person said a single word about it, then or later. I could hear Puckett breathing. He was 4 meters away, and I could hear him breathe over 7 idling diesels. That is when I understood how quiet it was. 7 trucks running, and it was like standing in a field. The jingle truck driver stayed in his cab. I could see him through his windshield with his hand still on the wheel, at 10 and 2, looking straight ahead down the road, patient. The way a man waits at a railway crossing for a train, he cannot see yet. Not afraid, not curious, waiting for a thing to be over. Here is the picture I have kept, and I get it back about once a month, usually when I am doing something ordinary like putting groceries in the car. 7 trucks stopped on a mountain road, dust standing still in the air, every tailgate lit, and on the road ahead of the column, laid out in front of us, the shadows of all 7 trucks stretched out long and forward, black on the gravel, thrown by something above us and behind us, and nobody looked up. That is the part I keep. 12 of us standing in our own shadows, all of us facing forward down the road, and not one person turned around. I did not turn around. I have never been able to explain that, and I have stopped trying. And I would like to tell you it was because we were disciplined, but that is not it either. I remember the smell out there. Jingle truck exhaust is sweeter than ours. Some different fuel or some different oil, and it was hanging in that dust with everything else that was not moving. I remember the cold coming through my gloves off the door handle. I remember thinking, in a very calm and practical voice, that I should get the camera out of the pouch on the door, and then not doing it, and not deciding not to do it either. I have wondered about that a great deal. There were 12 of us, and probably 9 cameras between us, and there is not one photograph. Then the shadows went, and Puckett said something, and we all got back in the trucks, and we drove. We had about 6 or 7 good minutes after that. Everybody on the radio at once, and it was a helicopter, obviously it was a helicopter with a light. and Anaya did his bit about the airline schedule and the in-flight service on this route being terrible, and I laughed until my eyes watered. That laughing was real. I want that in here because it was the best I felt that whole tour. We rolled through the gate at the top, and the log went in the way it always did. Departure time, arrival time, halt of 20 minutes for a road obstruction. My trip odometer said 103 kilometers. That road is 92 kilometers from gate to gate. I had zeroed the odometer at the bottom, the way I did every single run, because that is how you know when you are coming up on the bridge in the dark. 11 kilometers extra, on a road with no place to turn around and nowhere else to go. I checked it twice at the top, sitting in the cab with the engine off, with a little flashlight like the number was going to change. Then I got out and did not tell anyone for 2 years. When I finally did tell somebody, it was a woman I worked with at a terminal in Kentucky who had driven fuel in the same country a year after me, and I told her the odometer part first, because the odometer part is the part a driver believes. She did not laugh. She said, "Huh," and then she said her own thing, which was smaller than mine and which I am not going to repeat because it is hers. That is how it goes with this. Nobody opens with the light. Everybody opens with the number that was wrong. The next morning, the whole column got retaped. Every cat eye on all 7 trucks had curled up at the edges and lifted off, the way tape does when something has been hot against it. The motor pool did not say a word about it. They just retaped the trucks, and one of the mechanics gave me a look that I have thought about ever since, and neither of us said anything, because what would you say? I count light sources now. At a stoplight, at night, I will sit there and account for all of them. Street light, sign, the car behind me, the porch across the road. My husband thinks it is a driving thing, a professional habit, and it sort of is. I know where every reflector on my car is. I know which way each one faces. I am not afraid of that road. I would drive it tomorrow. I just like to know which direction the light is coming from, and I have not had a night since where I did not, and I would rather keep it that way. They already had a procedure for it. That is the part that has stayed with me. Not the light, the fact that 12 men lay down without being told, in an order, like it was a drill they had all done before. Name's Alan Pruitt. I was 45, National Guard, sent over as a police mentor, which meant I lived at a checkpoint on a valley road with a dozen Afghan policemen and 1 other American, and taught nobody anything, as far as I can tell. At home, I milk cows. 140 head in Vermont, and my father did it before me on the same ground, and I have been getting up at 4 in the morning my entire life for reasons that have nothing to do with the army. I mention that because of the goats. It is going to matter. When you spend 30 years around animals, you stop watching them the way most people do. You are not looking at the animal, you are reading the herd, and a herd is a single thing with a mood, and it will tell you about the weather, and about a stranger on the road, and about a dog 2 fields over that you cannot see. There is a difference between animals that are startled and animals that are waiting. Startled is loud, and it is over in a second. Waiting is quiet, and it lasts, and it is much worse. I was the only man at that checkpoint who was reading the goats. Everybody else was reading the road. The checkpoint was a mud brick room with a Hesco wall around it, on a bend in a valley road, with a mulberry tree that stained everything under it, purple for 3 weeks a year, and a pen of maybe 20 goats that belonged to the sergeant's cousin and lived there for reasons nobody explained. The river came past about 40 meters off, and it was loud. That is the thing about a mountain river. It is loud enough to hold a conversation under, and after a week you stop hearing it, and it is doing something to your ears the whole time. Summer nights the heat came up out of the ground until about 2 in the morning. The mud brick would hold it all day and hand it back all night. You would lie down on a cot and the ground under you would be warm like a stone in the sun. Now, the lantern. They hung a kerosene lantern on a nail outside the door every night. Every single night. And every single night for about 6 months, I explained that this was the worst idea in the world, because light discipline is not a suggestion, and a lantern on a wall on a valley road is a sign that says, "Here we are." Commander Syed Gul would listen to me the whole way through. He was a courteous man, and he had a real fondness for the photographs of my cows, which he asked to see about once a week and studied like a man reading a contract. He would listen and nod, and then he would go outside and rehang the lantern. His favorite of the photographs was one of a heifer standing in snow up past her knees, looking at the camera like she had been interrupted. He asked me twice whether the snow hurt her. I said, "No, she has got a coat on her like a rug," and he thought about that for a while and said that must be a good country. I would say, "Why?" He would say, "For the road." That was the whole answer. For the road. I got it maybe 40 times, and I never got a word more than that. There was a dog at that checkpoint. I never named him because the last thing I needed was a dog I had named. He was not brave. He had a spot under the water trailer, and he went to it whenever anything happened, and I always found that reasonable of him. I want to mention the wire, too, because I still have it on my hands. Hesco is wire mesh and fabric filled with dirt, and the wire ends stick out at the top corners, and there is not a man who lived behind that stuff who does not have 4 or 5 little white scars across his knuckles from reaching over it in the dark. I was one of 2 Americans there. My radio reached to the next hill, and then it did not, and there was a specific dead spot in the bend where you could hold the handset up over your head and get nothing at all. Nobody patrolled that road after dark. If something happened, help was 2 hours out on a good night, and there had not been a good night that month. It started with the goats. They stopped chewing. All of them together, which, if you have ever stood in a pen, you know does not happen. 20 animals eating is a sound like rain on a roof, and it went off, and every one of them was standing with its head up, facing the same corner of the pen. Not the road, the corner toward the ridge. I got up off the cot and went out to look at them, and that is when I noticed the lantern. The flame was leaning, not flickering, leaning steadily over toward the ridge at about a 30-degree angle, the way a flame leans in a draft. There was no wind. There was no wind at all. I put my hand up like an idiot, and turned it slowly around in the air the way you would test for a draft in a barn, and there was nothing. And that flame stayed over. I stood there about a minute with my hand out. Then the police started coming out. One at a time. No talking, not hurrying. Each one came out of the room and walked to the wall on the roadside and lay down on his side facing the wall, with his hands folded under his head, like a man going to bed. And the next one would come out and lie down 2 feet from him and do the same. They were not hiding. That was clear even then. They were not behind cover, and they were not down flat the way you go down when you are under fire. They were lying on their sides with their eyes closed, in a row, along a wall, like men in a bunkhouse. I did not understand what I was looking at. I still had my hand out. Syed Gul came out last. He took my elbow very gently, the way you would move an old woman across a street, and brought me over to the wall and put me down next to him and lay down himself. And then the light came up the road. It came from the direction of the ridge at about the height of a man, and it came at the speed of a man walking. Not fast, not slow. I could hear my own heart, and I could not hear the river. That is the detail I gave up trying to explain a long time ago. The river had been running for 40 minutes a stone's throw from where I was lying, and while that thing was on the road, it was not making any sound. It came back on afterward. It did not fade back on. It came back on the way a radio comes back on. The light came up the road and stopped exactly where the lantern's glow stopped. I want to be careful about that because it sounds like something out of a story. There is a place on the ground where lamplight gives out. It is not a line, it is a soft edge, you know it, if you have ever carried a lamp in a yard. That thing came to the outside of the lantern's glow, and it stopped there, and it did not come further, and it stood there. I was lying on my side, on warm ground, 6 feet from a stone wall, with my eyes open and my cheek on my own arm, and nobody around me moved. I could hear the men breathing. Somebody's boot creaked. That was it. Then it dimmed and slid back down the road. 2 of the policemen sat up right away and started arguing about a cousin's wedding, in normal voices, at normal volume, about money, and about who had been insulted by a seating arrangement. Somebody put a kettle on. It was 4 minutes of the most ordinary life you ever saw in your life. I sat up too and thought, well, all right, that is over. It came back, and it stopped at the same place, at the edge of the lamp glow, and this time it stayed. I have always said 19 minutes. I do not have a way to defend 19 minutes. It is what I said the next day, and I have never been able to talk myself down from it. Nobody moved for any of it. Syed Gul lay next to me with his eyes shut. At one point, without opening them, he said one thing, in a whisper, in English, which he almost never used with me. Bring in the goats. That was the last instruction anyone gave that night. He said it, and then he was quiet, and I lay there and did not bring in the goats because there was no version of me that was walking out to that pen. And I will tell you what changed for me. Lying there, past the middle of it, I stopped thinking of the waiting as indecision. That is what I had been assuming without knowing I was assuming it, that it was stopped, that it was hesitating, that it did not know what to do. It was not hesitating, it was looking. There is a difference, and you know the difference when you are the one being looked at, and there is no argument you can make afterward that gets you back to the other explanation. The dog was not under the water trailer. He was gone entirely, and he came back around 8 the next morning from up the valley somewhere, and he was fine, and he ate. In the morning, the lantern was still burning. I went out at first light and it was going, the flame steady and clean, and I reached up to take it off the nail and the glass was cold. Not warm, not room temperature. Cold like a bottle out of a spring, on a chimney around a burning flame, and my hand knew it before my head did, and I let go, and it swung on the nail. The wick was unburnt. That is the other thing. I trimmed the wicks on those lanterns myself half the time, and a wick that is burned all night is black and crumbly at the top. That one was clean and white all the way across, like a piece of new string. Syed Gul came out and looked at it and looked at me, and he took it off the nail and put it inside and did not say anything about it, and at dusk he hung it back up. For the road, I have a farm road that comes up a quarter mile from the county road. When somebody turns in at the bottom at night, their headlights come up the hill and swing across the front of the house and across the ceiling of my bedroom. I lie down every time, 16 years now. I hear a vehicle turn in at the bottom, and I am on the floor on my side with my hands under my head before I have thought about it, and I lie there until the light has gone by. My wife knows. She knew before I told her because she has watched me do it. We do not talk about it anymore. She does not think I am crazy, and she has never once asked me to stop, and that is most of what a man needs, as far as I can tell. There was no shadow under my hands. There was no shadow under the cot, or under the heater, or under anything in that room, and I was standing in the middle of it with the lights on. Sorry, I always start there and I always have to go back. My name's Ivy Delgado, Ivelisse, but everyone gave up on that in basic. I was 26, a medic, and that spring I had the night shift at the aid station on a small base, which is a canvas tent with a wood floor and a lot of expensive things in cardboard boxes. 5 months of nights by then. You learn a tent the way you learn a house. Every hour has its own sound. The heater ticks when it cycles and knocks once about 4 seconds later. The canvas breathes when the wind comes across, in and out, slow. And the ridgepole makes a noise like a rope on a boat. There are trucks at 11 and again at 2. And when one goes by outside, the light runs along the seams of the tent, up one side and down. I could tell you what time it was from inside that tent with my eyes closed. I want that on the record before I tell you the rest. There were 2 cots, a plywood counter with a burn mark on it shaped like Ohio, a heater, and a string of bare bulbs down the ridgepole. No windows. That is the thing about a tent like that. You cannot see out. You can only see the seams light up and the door flap, and that is the entire relationship you have with the outside world for 8 hours at a stretch. We had an old oxygen concentrator that ticked. It was probably older than me. When it was running, it made a tick once every 4 seconds, absolutely reliable, and after about my 3rd week I stopped using my watch at night and started using the tick. 15 ticks is a minute. You would be surprised how quickly that becomes how you think. I should say what night shift at a place like that is actually like, because people picture something dramatic, and it is the opposite. It is being the only person awake with a job. Everybody else on that base is asleep in rows, and there is one lit structure on your side of the wire, and it is yours. And you sit in it under a string of bulbs with a book you have read twice, and you are on duty in the purest sense of the word. Nothing is happening, and you are entirely responsible for it. I had a routine. Supply count at midnight. Sweep the floor at 1. Refill the sharps and check the seal on the drug box. Rewrite the board. Eat the second half of whatever I had brought over from dinner, which was almost always cold and almost always fine. That night I had one patient. An old man from the village, 70-something, with a wrist he had broken 3 days before, and had set himself badly, and his daughter had finally talked him into coming in. She waited outside the wire from about midnight, because she would not leave and we could not bring her in. And one of the guys on the gate kept taking her tea, which I think about a lot. A wrist that has been set wrong and left 3 days does not look the way people think. It is not gruesome, it is swollen, and it sits at an angle that your eye keeps trying to correct, like a picture frame hanging crooked, and the skin over it is shiny and tight. He had wrapped it himself in a strip of cloth and he was quietly proud of the wrapping. And honestly, the wrapping was not bad. The old man was on the near cot. He had that particular patience old men have in every country, where they will sit through anything, and are mainly worried about being a bother. At around 2, the tick slowed. Not stopped. It went from 4 seconds to something longer, and then it steadied there. A new interval, perfectly regular, just wrong. I counted it against my watch twice. I got up and checked the machine, because that is what you do, and the machine was fine. Flow was fine. The light on it was the color it is supposed to be. I sat back down and it kept ticking at the wrong speed. Then I noticed the moths. Every night all spring there were moths on those bulbs. A dozen of them, at least, bumping around up in the ridgepole, and the little brown ones that just sit. It is one of those things you complain about for 2 weeks, and then it is simply part of the room. There were none. Not on the bulbs, not in the air, not on the floor. I looked at the floor for a long time because that is where they should have been if something had happened to them. Nothing. Clean plywood. Then the seam light came. It looked exactly like a truck outside, that same bright line running along where the canvas panels meet, sliding as the vehicle passes. Except there was no engine, and it did not pass. It went along the side of the tent, and around the back corner, and along the back, and around the other corner, and up the far side, and came back to the front. All the way around. Smoothly, at a walking pace, without a sound, and then it started around again. I stood up in the middle of the tent and turned in a circle following it. I remember being embarrassed about that afterward, that I just stood there turning around like a kid in the snow, and the generator was 40 meters away, running, and it had been the background of every night for 5 months. I could not hear it. There was no sound in that room at all except the tick, which was still going at the wrong interval, and which was suddenly the loudest thing in the world. The old man opened his eyes. He did not sit up. He looked at the ceiling of the tent for a moment, and then he looked at me, and then he reached over with his good hand and patted my hand, once, the way you do with somebody who is worried about a hospital visit, and then he closed his eyes and went back to sleep. Really slept. I watched him breathe. He was still asleep 4 minutes later when I checked, because at that point I badly needed something to check. It dimmed after that, and I laughed at myself out loud, and I did a supply count. That is not a professional thing to do at 2 in the morning. That is a thing you do to have something to do with your hands. 4 boxes of gauze, 12 of these, 6 of those, and the same 4 items missing that were always missing. The tick went back to 4 seconds. I got to the bottom of the list and felt fine. I felt genuinely fine. I remember thinking that I would tell this at breakfast and it would be funny. Then the tent went bright. Not a beam, not from one side. Every surface at once, the walls, the ceiling, the floor, all of it the same value, like standing inside a light bulb. It was not even that bright, is the thing people get wrong when I tell it. It was about like an overcast day at noon. It was completely even, and there were no shadows. I looked down, and there was no shadow under my hands. I moved them. Nothing. I looked under the cot, and there was light under there, the same as everywhere else all the way to the wall. I looked under the heater. I looked at the legs of the plywood counter, and where the counter met the floor there was no line at all, no dark. Nothing to tell you where one thing stopped and the other started. I have gone at this from every direction for 14 years. I have talked to people who do lighting for films. You can get close, they tell me, with enough sources and enough bounce in a room built for it. In a canvas tent with 1 string of bulbs, there is no arrangement of anything that makes an object stop having a shadow. There were no shadows. I say it plainly because it is the only way I have ever found to say it. There were no shadows in that room, and I stood in the middle of it and did not move. I do not know how long. My honest answer is that the tick was going and I was not counting, which is not like me at all. Then it went, the way a cloud goes off the sun, and the generator was there again, loud, and the heater ticked and knocked 4 seconds later exactly as it was supposed to, and I sat down on the folding chair, which was very cold. Here's the part that I noticed at 3, when I finally got up to write my shift note. Everything luminous in that tent was fully charged. The glow tape on the litter handles, that stuff takes light in and gives it back for a couple of hours, and by 2 in the morning it is a dull green suggestion at best. It was blazing. The hands of my watch, the emergency strip by the door flap. All of it, brighter than I had ever seen it, hours after any of it had seen real light, and it stayed that way for a long while. I want to be fair to the glow tape and say the obvious thing, which is that it charges off any light, and that whatever came through the canvas was light, and so of course it charged. That is not mysterious. That is exactly what the material does. What I cannot get past is that a canvas tent is not transparent. To charge that tape through the walls, from every direction, evenly, for that long, and then to have nothing to show for it in the morning, no scorch, no melt, no smell, nothing on the tent at all. I sat and watched the litter handles glow, and did not write anything in the shift note about any of it. What I wrote was, patient resting, vitals stable, no complaints. The old man went home at first light. His daughter came in through the gate and took his good arm and said something to him, and he said something back, and she laughed at him, and they went off down the road. He turned around at about 100 meters and raised the bad hand at me, the one in the splint, which he was absolutely not supposed to be raising. The guy from the gate came by later that morning to get his thermos back, and mentioned in a completely ordinary voice that it had gotten light out around 2 and he had thought his eyes were going. And then he took his thermos and left, and I stood there holding a box of gauze. That is the only corroboration I have ever had, and I did not ask him a single follow-up question, and I have regretted that for 14 years. I never asked the old man anything either. There was no way to. And I have thought more than once that he would not have had an answer that helped, and that the patting of my hand was the answer, and it was the kindest one available. I turn on a light in a room and I look for my shadow. Every time, before I sit down. Kitchen, hotel, waiting room, does not matter. I find it, and then I am fine. My husband thinks it is a checking habit from the job, like counting exits. I have let him think that for 9 years, mostly because the true answer takes about 40 minutes, and most rooms do not deserve it. But every so often I catch myself doing it in a hotel at 2 in the morning, standing in the middle of the carpet with the lamp on, looking down at my own feet, and I think, there it is. Good. And then I go to bed. The column bent into the wind, and ash does not do that, and I've been reading ash for a living since I was 33 years old. I'm Charlie Boykin, Charlene, on paper. I was 42, a civilian contractor, and my job on that base was the burn pit, which is the least glamorous job on any base anywhere, and the one I would take again tomorrow. I'm from Dothan, Alabama. I ran fires before I ever went overseas. 9 years of it. Land clearing and site work. The kind of company where you learn everything by doing it wrong once in front of somebody who is patient. I am the last person on that base who ought to have seen anything. I want that in there. I don't watch the sky. I watch a fire and I watch smoke, and I watch a windsock when there is one, and mostly I watch the ash. Let me explain that part, because everything that happened hangs on it. A burn pit is a hole the size of a soccer field with everything a base throws away in it, and it burns all the time, and the whole trick of my job is keeping the smoke off the people. That is it. That is the entire job description under all the paperwork. Keep it off the tents, keep it off the flight line, keep it off the chow hall. To do that, you have to know the wind, and you never trust a flag for that, because a flag tells you about the wind at the flagpole. The column tells you the truth. You stand back from the pit 100 yards, you look at where the smoke leans in the first 50 feet, and then where it leans up high, and that tells you what the wind is doing at both levels, and whether it is about to change. Ash falls straighter than smoke. Ash is the honest one. Smoke will curl and swirl and lie to you. But ash comes down more or less where the air says it comes down, and if the ash is landing on the road behind me, I have got about 20 minutes before that smoke lays down on the container huts. I had been reading that column every night for 2 years. I could call the wind direction to within about 20 degrees, and the speed within about 5 miles an hour, without turning around, and I got tested on it by an Air Force kid with an anemometer more than once because he thought it was funny. I won every time but one. The pit sat at the far corner of that base, on the downwind side, behind a berm, as far from everybody as they could put it, which is exactly where you put it, and I never complained. There was a road of packed ash going out to it that took footprints like fresh snow, a front loader with a broken seat spring and a towel folded on the pan. A water truck with a fitting that leaked and made its own permanent mud puddle in the driest country I have ever stood in. A cat that lived on the berm and would not be caught. People ask what goes in a pit like that, and the honest answer is everything. Packaging mostly, cardboard by the ton, pallets, plastic sheeting, ration wrappers, office paper, broken furniture, uniforms. Nobody could get clean, tires when somebody snuck them in on me. There was a rule about batteries, and the rule was ignored about twice a week. And you knew when it had been ignored because the fire would change color and go a little green at the edges and taste like a penny. The taste is the part that stays. Pit air gets in your mouth and sits there for hours, and you can drink a whole bottle of water and still have it. I washed those coveralls 40 times and could still find it in them. At 3 a.m, the fire threw orange up the underside of its own smoke, and past the berm there was nothing, and then the mountains, black on black, and you could only tell where they were because the stars stopped. There was one other soul out there with me most nights. Rashid had been running that pit longer than any American on that base had been in the country. He did not talk much, and he did not need to. He would raise 2 fingers when he wanted the loader moved, and I would move it. That night, the column bent. It went over toward the mountains, which was into the wind. I could feel the wind on the left side of my face, coming across from the runway side, steady, maybe 8 miles an hour. And the smoke was going the other way, not swirling, not eddying off the berm, which happens and which I know the look of. It leaned, and it held there, at about a 30-degree bend, for I would say 2 minutes. I walked out to the side to get a better line on it, because I assumed my eyes were bad, and I have never once been wrong about that column. Then the fire quieted. Now, a pit fire that size is loud. It roars and it pops, and it collapses in on itself every so often with a whump you feel in your knees. What happened was that it got quiet without getting smaller. The flames were the same height. The light was the same. The sound went down like somebody had turned the volume knob on it and left the picture alone. I could hear the ash landing. That is the thing I tell people last, because it sounds like nothing until you have stood there. Ash falling on packed ash makes about as much noise as snow. And I could hear it all around me, a soft, dry, general sound, over a fire that fills a soccer field. Then the smoke stood straight up. Straight up, in that wind, which was still on my face. I could hear it whistling on the truck mirror. I could see it moving the corner of the tarp on the water truck, and the column went up out of that pit like a rope somebody was pulling on from a long way overhead. Rashid walked to the water truck, sat down on the running board, put his hands on his knees and waited. He did not look at me. He did not tell me to come over. He sat there the way a man sits in a bus shelter in the rain, and I understood without one word being said that this was a thing he had seen before, and that the procedure was, sit down. I did not sit down. I want to be honest about that, and I am not proud of it. I stood there like a fool with my hands out at my sides. There was something in the column. Not a thing in the smoke. A place the smoke went around. There was a shape up in that rope of smoke where the smoke had to go out and around and then come back together above it, the way water goes around a rock in a creek. And there was nothing there to go around. It was a long way up. And then it was not a long way up. I did not see it move, I want to say that plainly. I have never been able to describe the in-between of it, because there was no in-between. It was high in the smoke, and then it was low, at about the height of a light pole, at the far side of the pit, and my eyes had never left it. Then it straightened out. The column went back over with the wind, the fire came back up loud, and I got in the loader and pushed a fresh lane of trash into the pit, because that is what you do, and because work is a wonderful thing when you need it to be. I got maybe 3 minutes of that, the engine noise, the blade, the smell, all of it ordinary. Then the fire went out. Not down, out, all of it, across that whole pit, at the same instant, the way a candle goes out. A fire that size takes hours to go down with water on it, and I have never gotten one out on purpose in less than a shift. It went out, and it stayed out, and there was still light out there. Not from the pit. The pit was dark, and it was still radiating heat at me. I could feel it on my face while I was looking at a black field. The light was coming from somewhere above the berm, even and flat, and it lay across everything. The loader, the ash road, the water truck, Rashid sitting on the running board with his hands on his knees. Every dog on that side of the base was up at the wire. There were always dogs out there, and they always barked at everything, all night, all year. They were standing in a line at the fence, silent, facing us. I stood beside that loader with heat still coming off my coveralls, in a field of dead fire, and something looked at the place where my fire had been. That is the sentence I have used for 16 years, and it is the closest I have gotten. I do not know how long. Rashid says 4 minutes. He said it the next day, and he said it again years later on the telephone, so I will take 4 minutes. Then it was not there, and the dogs went off like an alarm all at once, and Rashid stood up and dusted the back of his trousers, and I got a light and walked out to the pit edge. The ash lay in a wide, smooth ring across the middle of it, smooth like a bedsheet somebody had pulled tight. And there was nothing in it. No drag mark, no track, no print going in and none coming out. And that ash takes a print if a bird lands on it. The cat was on the berm the whole time. I found that out afterward, when it came down and walked past me on the ash road at its normal pace, doing its normal business. And I stood there and watched a cat cross a road and felt something in my chest loosen about an inch. I walked the pit edge for a while with my light. I was looking for a reason. That is what I do. A fitting came loose. A line got kinked. Somebody left something where it should not be. There is always a reason, and finding it is the good part of the job. There was no reason. There was a cold field of ash and a smooth ring in the middle of it. I went back for my truck around 4. It had been sitting out there all night the way it always did, and it was covered in ash the way it always was, a good half-inch of it on the hood by morning. There was one broad band across that hood, about 3 feet wide, that was clean. Not wiped. Clean, like the ash had come down everywhere else and simply had not come down there. I ran my finger along the edge of it, and the edge was sharp. Then I drove back and slept, and at breakfast I said nothing to anybody, and I have said nothing to almost anybody since. There is not a form for it, and there is not a person to give the form to. I will not sit and watch a fire burn down anymore. My family has a place at the lake, and there is always a fire, and everybody sits around it until it is embers and coals and everyone is quiet and happy. I put mine out, early with water, all the way out, and then I go inside. My nephew thinks that is the funniest thing in the world, a woman who ran a burn pit for 2 years and cannot sit with a campfire. He does the bit at every holiday. I laugh every time because it is a good bit, and because the alternative is telling him. My headlight stopped short. That is the only way I have ever found to say it. The beam ran out about 40 feet in front of the blade and ended, at a curve, the way light ends when it hits glass. Ray Thibodeau. Houma, Louisiana, born and raised, and I have run equipment since I was 17 years old. I was over there as a construction operator, 47 years old that spring, cutting a road into the side of a mountain so that the little posts up top could be supplied by truck instead of by air, which is a sensible idea and took a very long time. Now, I have run machines at night my whole life. Fog on the river road. Rain so hard the wipers are decoration. Ice up north on a job I should not have taken. Levee work in the swamp where the ground moves under you and there is nothing to look at but your own light and the bugs coming into it. And the one thing you learn, before anything else, is exactly what your own lights do. You know where your beam ends on gravel, and where it ends on mud, which is closer, because mud drinks it. You know what dust does to it and what fog does to it, and they are not the same. You know how the light comes off wet rock. A man who works nights knows the shape of his own light the way you know the shape of your own kitchen in the dark. So, when I tell you that my light stopped, I want it understood that this is the one subject on Earth where I am the expert in the room. The grade was about 4 kilometers of switchback above the camp. Raw, new cut, pale against the dark hill, with the cut face on one side, cold rock and torn roots, and on the other side the drop going down into black. Mud that froze after midnight and thawed by 9. The light plant had quit 2 nights before. There was an argument about a part. There is always an argument about a part. So, I was working off machine lights, which is fine. I have done more of that in my life than not. My hands are not what they were. 2 fingers on the left do not straighten all the way. From a job in 1988 that was my own fault, and in the cold they ache in a way I can set my watch by. I mention it because I had them wrapped around a lever for most of what I'm about to tell you, and I remember exactly how they felt. I had a thermos my wife sent over. She wrapped the lid in green electrical tape because the seal was going, and I never replaced that thermos, and it is on a shelf in my garage right now with the same tape on it. I was up there alone. Nobody works a grade alone in the world, and everybody works a grade alone over there, and the camp was 4 kilometers of switchback below me, and I was supposed to check in on the radio every hour, and the sergeant who took those checks did not care if I missed one. Before I tell you the rest, I have to tell you about the stakes. A surveyor comes through and sets wooden stakes, lath we call it, thin flat wood, about 3 feet, every 25 feet along the line of the cut, and each one has orange flagging tape stapled at the top so you can see it from the machine. That tells you where the grade is supposed to go. There is a string line, too, run between them at the reference height. I set my own most evenings before dark, because I like them where I like them. It is a good job. You walk your line with a hammer and a bundle of lath under your arm, and you set them, and you look back down at what you have set, and they are never level with each other. They cannot be. The ground is not level. They rise and fall the way the hill rises and falls, and when you look down a line of stakes on a mountain, you are looking at a picture of the mountain. Understand that, and the rest of this will land the way it landed on me. Around 2 in the morning, the flagging turned. All of it. Every piece of orange tape on that line of stakes pointing the same way, up the cut toward the top of the hill, and holding there, stiff, like they were in a hard wind. There was no wind. It had been dead still since about midnight. I know that because the dust I was making was hanging behind me instead of going anywhere. I got out and stood on the track and looked down that line for a good while. 40 stakes, maybe. All of them flagged the same direction. All of them still. Then the radio went clean. I need to say this right. It did not go silent. A radio has a hiss on it, a floor, the sound of the air, and you stop hearing it after 5 minutes, but it is always there, and your ear knows. What happened was that the hiss went away and left the radio on, clean, like a channel with nothing on it at all, not even the nothing. That is not a thing a radio does. A radio that loses power goes dead. A radio that is squelched goes quiet in a different way. I flicked it off and back on to hear the hiss come up, and it did not come up. I sat back in the seat and put my hands on the levers, because I did not know what else to do with them, and that is when my light stopped short. 40 feet out, the beam ended, and it did not fade or scatter, which is what light does when it dies out. It ended at a line, and the line was curved, bowed toward me, like the edge of a very big glass jar set down in front of the machine. Past that edge, there was dark, and it was not the same dark as the rest of the night. I have thought about how to say this for 15 years. The dark on the hill was the dark you know, gray at the edges, a little starlight in it, shapes if you look long enough. The dark past that curve was a dark with nothing in it. It was flat. It did not have a distance. Then it moved. The curve slid along the cut, off to my right, and it took the ends of my beams with it. My lights got longer as it went, foot by foot, until the beam was throwing all the way out to the far turn the way it should have been the whole time. And as that edge went along, the flagging on the stakes turned to follow it. One at a time, down the line, each piece coming around like a weather vane and holding on it. I watched that happen for about 8 stakes, and then I did not want to watch it anymore. The whole time, I could not hear my machine. A dozer is a physical thing. You do not just hear it. You feel the engine in your back and in your teeth and in the loose change in the ashtray. It was running. The gauges were up, the exhaust was going, the seat was buzzing my legs, and there was no sound of it, none. I put my hand flat on the glass and felt it going and heard nothing at all. Then the edge went away up the cut, and my light went long, and the hill sounds came back. A rock going down the slope somewhere for a long time. The cut face ticking the way it does at night when the cold gets into it. The engine, loud as ever. I laughed. I said something out loud to the machine, which I do because I have always talked to them, and this one I had been calling Aunt Rose on account of the way she leaned when she was working. I put my hand back on the lever, and she stalled. Everything electrical in that cab died at the same instant. Gauges, lights, radio, all of it, including the things that cannot go at the same instant because they are on different circuits, and I would like somebody to explain that part to me one day. And the cab filled up with white light. It came from no direction. That is the part I cannot make people see. There was no window it was coming through. It was in there, the whole cab, even under the dash where my boots were, even in the footwell, and it cast nothing. My hands on the levers had no shadow on the floor. The wear on the lever grips did not have a shadow in it, and that is a thing you cannot get rid of in normal light. I sat there with both hands on those levers and I did not move them. I was not held down. Nobody was pressing on me. I could have moved, I believe, if I had decided to, and I did not decide to, and I've had 15 years to work out which of those 2 sentences is the true one, and I am not there yet. That is my honest answer. I sat in a machine I have run for 30 years, with my hands where they belonged, and I did not move, and I do not know why. It went the way a light in a room goes when the switch is thrown. Aunt Rose came back at the second try, which is one more try than she usually needed. I finished the shift. I graded another 60 feet, badly, and then I sat there until the sky came up gray behind the ridge. I did not call anything in. I want to be straight about that since it is the question people ask. There was a radio in my hand for a good part of the night and a sergeant at the other end of it who was awake and who would have answered. And what I would have said is, my lights are doing something. That is the whole message. There is no second sentence to it that does not make a man sound like he ought to be sent down the hill and given a different job, and I liked my job, and I was 47 years old and had 2 years to go on that contract. So, I said nothing, and I have thought since that this is probably how most of it stays quiet. Not fear of being disbelieved. Just a man doing the arithmetic on his own paycheck at 2 in the morning. At first light, I walked my line. Every stake was driven to the same depth, every one of them. The tops of 40 pieces of lath running dead level across ground that falls 11 feet over that distance. I know it falls 11 feet because that is why the grade was there, and I had the numbers in my pocket. They were level like a fence rail, like somebody had put a string on them and pushed each one down until it met the string, which is a thing you could do with a whole day and a lot of patience and no reason on earth to do it. The string line I had left slack the night before was drawn up tight. I flicked it with a finger and it hummed. I pulled every one of those stakes and reset the line myself before the crew came up, and I never told a soul on that mountain, and I finished my rotation and went home. I still walk a job at first light, before anybody else is up with coffee, and I go down the line and I look at the stakes. They are never level, not once in 15 years. They go up and down with the ground the way God and the surveyor intended, and every single time I see that, something in my chest sits back down. That is the correct answer. That is what a line of stakes on a hill is supposed to look like, and I am glad of it every morning, and I expect I will be until I am done working. 14 people told me over one winter, and not one of them wrote it down. My name is Peter Halloway. I was the chaplain on a ridge post that year, 35 years old, from Traverse City, Michigan, and I had been ordained for 6 years and in uniform for 4 of them. I should say at the front that I am not a believer in this sort of thing. I do not mean that as a defense. I mean it as a fact about the instrument. I was raised by an engineer. I am suspicious of the miraculous by temperament, which is an awkward way for a clergyman to be built, and I have made my peace with it. The chapel was a tent, canvas, plywood floor, a space heater that smelled like burning dust for the first 10 minutes every time, and a guitar somebody had left behind with the 5th string missing, which I played badly and only when nobody was inside. 12 folding chairs. I set them out for services and stacked them afterward, alone, every week. The same 12, the same shallow arc, the same spacing, because I had worked out the spacing in my first month, and after that I never thought about it again. Chair, gap, all the way around, and then 2 rows if 6 people came, which was a good week. I want to be honest about what that ritual was for. It was not for them. Setting out chairs for an hour is one of the few things a chaplain does that has a beginning and an end. Everything else in that job is open at both ends. The post was on a ridge, and the ridge went up into cloud by about noon every day and stayed there. In winter, there was snow in the wire that held its shape for days, in these little curved shelves, because nothing ever came through to disturb it. People have odd ideas about what soldiers talk to a chaplain about. It is almost never God, it is money, and it is somebody's brother, and it is a marriage that is going wrong 4,000 miles away in slow motion where nobody can reach it. It is a man who cannot sleep and does not want that written anywhere. Mostly, you are a room with a door that does not open onto a file. That is what I was for, on that ridge. Not a priest particularly, a room with a door. My wife wrote me twice a week that winter, and there was one letter I read so many times the fold went soft. I still have it. She was telling me about a dog we did not end up getting. The first one told me at the coffee urn. There was a coffee urn that scalded people, and a sign about the urn that nobody read, and a young man came and stood next to me while I was filling a cup and said that a guy on his team had seen something over the mountains a few nights before, and had been sort of weird about it since. A guy on his team. That is how it always starts. I have been doing this long enough to know that when somebody comes to you about a friend, you are talking to the friend about 4 times out of 5. I said, "What did he see?" And the young man said, "Lights, but not lights." And then he did a thing with his hand, a slow, flat gesture. And then he said he had to go, and he went. 4 more in 10 days. Then more. By the end of that winter it was 14, and I know it was 14 because I counted, which I am not sure was the right thing to do. They were always alone when they told me. Never in a group, never in front of anyone. They came at odd hours, the way people come to a chaplain when the thing they want to say is not the thing they open with. Somebody would ask about extending leave for a family matter, and then, at the door, with a hand on the flap, would say, "Can I tell you something else?" And they were certain. That is what got me in the end. There was no wobble in them. These were people who could tell you the time it started, and what the wind was doing, and what they were holding when it began. I have taken confessions of things people did 20 years ago and gotten less detail, and every single one of them ended the same way. Some version of, "I am not putting that on paper." Not one of them asked me what I thought it was. That was the strange part. People ask a chaplain what he thinks about everything. Nobody asked me about this. They wanted the telling, and then they wanted to leave, and I would sit in that tent afterward with the heater ticking, holding somebody else's night. There is an etiquette to it too, which I learned quickly and never wrote down anywhere. You do not ask a man what he saw. If he wants you to have it, he will hand it to you. 9 soldiers on a small post, all carrying the same thing, all of them alone with it, and me carrying 9 of them, and no way at all to introduce any of those men to each other. I want to say that plainly, because it is the part of this that still bothers me most, and it has nothing to do with lights. Every one of them thought he was the only one. Then came my night. It was late, past midnight, and I was in the chapel tent because I could not sleep, and I had told myself I was going to restring the guitar, which I had no strings for. The guy lines started to hum. A canvas tent is held down by ropes, and when the wind comes across them they buzz, one at a time, whichever one the wind is on. What happened was that all of them started at once, and they did not buzz. They held a note, a steady, low chord, all the way around the tent, like somebody drawing a bow across the whole thing. There was no wind that night. I had walked over in it. The snow and the wire had been sitting there in its little shelves for 4 days. Then the light came through the canvas. Canvas takes light in a particular way. It does not go transparent, it goes luminous. The whole panel comes up like a lampshade. All 4 walls came up together, and the tent got brighter than it had ever been with the bulbs on. And I could see the weave of the fabric, and the stitching, and every stain on it from every previous chaplain. And the shadows of the chair legs began to swing around the walls. That is what told me it was moving. 12 chairs stacked at the side of the tent, and their shadows came around the canvas. Slowly, the way shadows go around a room when somebody carries a lamp past a doorway. Around and around again. Whatever was outside was going around the tent, and it was doing it at the pace of a man in no hurry. Everything else was gone. That is the piece I always have to stop and put properly. The generator on that post ran all night, every night. There was wind on the ridge more or less permanently. There was a flag halyard that rang against the pole, ping, 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 and had rung against it since the day the pole went up, and men had complained about it in writing. All of it, gone. Only the guy lines holding their cord. I did not go outside. I have been asked that 100 times, and the answer is no. I stood in the middle of the tent with my hands at my sides like a man waiting for a bus. There was a sentry in the near tower, and I could see the shape of the tower through the wall when the light came up behind it. He never turned around. He stayed exactly where he was, in the correct posture, watching the correct sector, for the whole of it. I have never asked him. He rotated out 2 months later. I have thought about finding him, and I have decided against it every time, and I could not tell you honestly whether that is respect or cowardice. Near the end of it, I heard my name. not spoken. I want to be careful, because this is the one part where I am relying on a sense that is not really a sense. It was the way you hear your name when you are half asleep and someone says it in another room. It arrives already inside you, and you are awake before you have decided anything. Once, correctly, both parts of it. Then it passed, and every sound on that ridge came back at once. The generator, the wind, the halyard ringing on the pole, and it was so loud that I put a hand on a chair. I prayed, briefly and badly, mostly nouns. It helped a great deal more than I expected it to, and I have never fully known what to do with that. Then I slept, in my clothes on the plywood, and woke at first light with my face on my arm. The chairs were outside, all 12 out in the snow in front of the tent, in a shallow arc, evenly spaced, facing the ridge. My arc, my spacing, set out the way I set them out, the way I had set them out every week for 5 months. And there were no tracks. The snow around those chairs was unmarked in every direction. No boot prints going out, none coming back. Nothing between the chairs, no drag, no scuff. 4 days of untouched snow with 12 chairs standing in it. I brought them in myself, in the dark, one at a time, before anybody was up. I am not proud of that. I have said so from the pulpit, actually, once in a very disguised way that nobody understood. I had spent a whole winter being the one man on that post who could be told a thing. And when it was my turn, I carried the evidence inside and stacked it against the wall. Attendance went up for 3 weeks after that. I have never known what to do with that either. 11 one Sunday, which was the most I ever had up there, and I had to unstack the second row, and nobody said one word about why they had come. We sang badly. I preached on something safe out of Luke. Afterward, a corporal shook my hand for a beat longer than he needed to and said, "Thanks, chaps," and went off to eat. By March, it was back down to 6, and then the weather turned, and the road opened, and people rotated, and the whole thing folded up and went wherever those winters go. I set out 1 extra chair now. My church at home is not large. We have a room that holds 60, and we use about half of it. I put out 1 more than we need, on the end, every week, and people assume it is for a latecomer, and once a year somebody actually sits in it, and I like that very much. I have stopped trying to decide what it was. That is not the part I stayed up nights over anyway. 14 people told me. Not one of them wrote it down. That is a fact about people, rather than a fact about the sky, and it is the one I could actually verify, and it is the one that keeps me up. The stars behind it never went out. That is the whole of it, really. Everything else I could probably talk myself out of. My name's Jenna Carrick. I was 30, a weather observer from Salina, Kansas, and that summer I had the night shift at a small airfield that closed at 6 in the evening and opened again at 6 in the morning. My job, all of it, was this: go outside every hour, look at the sky, and write down what is there. That is not a joke version of the job, that is the job. You walk out, you stand still for a minute or two and let your eyes settle, and then you record the cloud, and how high it is, and how much of the sky it covers, and how far you can see, and whether anything is obstructing that, and what the wind is doing. And then you go in and you put it on the form. I loved it. I want to say that early, because the rest of this is quiet, and I do not want anybody thinking I was unhappy out there. Getting paid to look at the sky twice as often as anyone else on Earth is a wonderful way to spend a year. The shack was plywood. There was a swamp cooler that dripped, and a coffee can under the drip that somebody had put there in a previous decade. There was a cloud chart taped to the wall that an airman had drawn by hand, badly, with the cumulus looking like a sheep, and I loved that chart, and I have no idea what became of it. There was a pen that wrote upside down, which I kept in my sleeve pocket like it was jewelry, and there was a step outside the door, 2 feet of concrete. That was my observation deck. That was where I stood, on the hour, every hour all summer. Now, about the form. The form has a box for everything. That is what people do not appreciate. There is a box for the cloud type, and there is a code for every kind of cloud there is, and there is a box for how much of the sky it takes up in eighths. There is a box for visibility, and a box for obstruction, fog, haze, smoke, dust, blowing sand. And at the bottom there is a remarks line, and remarks are not for opinions. Remarks are for things like lightning distant northwest. Remarks are for a fact you can classify that did not fit in one of the other boxes. The rule, which is the first thing they teach you and the last thing you forget, is you record what you can classify. That night was clear. It was warm, still warm at midnight, the way it is out there in summer, where the ground gives the day back to you all night long. The runway lights were on, and they went away from me in 2 rows and came together at a point, like a picture of a runway in a book. The field was closed. There was nobody in the tower. There were jackals somewhere out past the fence, doing the 2 different noises they do, one that sounds like an argument and one that sounds like a question. It was 11 steps from my chair to the step outside. I know that the way you know the stairs in your own house. I want to tell you the nicest part of that job, because it is the part I still use. You learn to judge how high a cloud is by eye. There is equipment for it, and the equipment is better than I am, but you learn it anyway, by how sharp the edges are, by how fast it is moving compared to the one above it, by the color of the underside. And after a few months of guessing and then checking, you are right most of the time, and you stop being able to walk out of a building without doing it. On a clear night, there is nothing to guess. You walk out, and it is all just there, and the whole observation takes a minute. The rest of the hour is yours. I went out at midnight, and at 1, and at 2, and it was the same each time, and it was lovely. There was a light in the southeast that I took for a star. I want to be very clear that I treated it like a star for the better part of an hour. It was where a star is. It sat there like a star sits. I have spent my life looking at that sky, and I know what it does. And there was nothing about that light for 50-some minutes that asked anything of me. Then it moved about the width of my hand, held out at arm's length. Slowly. Over a couple of minutes, and it moved the wrong way. Everything in that sky drifts one direction over a night, because we are the ones turning, and this went across that drift and settled again. I stood on the step and watched it, and did not write anything. Then the jackals stopped. The field got so quiet that I could hear the ballasts in the runway lights ticking, and the nearest of those is a good 800 meters from that step. I have never heard them before or since. I did not know they made a sound, and then it did the thing that I have never been able to put anywhere. When I looked straight at it, it dimmed, not out. It went down to almost nothing, like a coal, and when I let my eyes drift a little to the side of it, it came back up, full, steady. If you know anything about looking at faint things at night, you know that is backwards. A faint star is best seen slightly off to the side, because of how the eye is built. This was the opposite, and it was consistent, and I did it 8 or 9 times standing on that step like a woman testing a light switch, and nothing else happened. I want that understood too. It did not come toward me. It did not do anything at all except sit out there and let me look at it, and I stood in the warm dark with my arms crossed and looked. Then I noticed the stars behind it. They were not covered. It was in front of them. It was nearer. It was clearly nearer. It had size. And the stars were still there all the way through it, unchanged. Not dimmed, not smeared. The same little arrangement of them I had been using for a week to find that part of the sky. I checked twice. I moved my head to be sure it was not something on my glasses or in my eye. I stepped down off the step and stood on the gravel and checked again from there. The stars were shining through it. I stayed out about 20 minutes. It stayed where it was. At some point, the jackals started up again out past the fence. One, and then several. And I took that as the end of it, and I went in. And I filled out the form. Sky clear. Visibility 10. Winds calm. Temperature and dew point where they had been all night. No remarks. I have been asked about that, and I want to answer it carefully, because it sounds like a confession, and it is not one. There is no box for it. There is no code for a light with stars behind it. Remarks are for facts you can classify, and I could not classify it, and a weather observation is a legal document that other people fly airplanes on. I did not decide to hide it. There was simply nowhere on the paper for it to go. I have thought about that more than I have thought about the light. There is a version of me that wrote something on the remarks line. I think about her sometimes. I do not think it would have gone anywhere. The form goes into a system that wants numbers, and a sentence in the remarks that no code matches is a thing somebody has to deal with in the morning, and what they would have dealt with is me. But I would have liked to have written it. Not for anyone. Just to have it on a piece of paper somewhere with the date on it in my own hand, the way a thing is real when it is written down. I still go outside on the hour. Not all night, not anymore. But in the evening, at the top of the hour, wherever I have been, 3 more bases after that one, and now a house with a porch and a rail that needs painting, I step out and I look up. Mostly, it is an airplane. Sometimes it is a satellite going over, and I like those. I like knowing what they are. Mostly it is nothing at all, just the sky doing the ordinary enormous thing it does. That is fine. The looking is the point. It was always the point. I have never seen it again. I do not expect to now. What I have decided, after all these years, is that on a clear night over a quiet field, the sky did something the sky does not do. And there was nowhere on the form for it, so it did not happen anywhere except in me. Maybe I misread the whole thing. Maybe it was some ordinary thing at an angle I had never had it at before. But then again, maybe not. My husband leaves the porch light off for me now because I asked him to, because it is easier on the eyes. So I go out at 9 or 10 into the warm dark, and the boards are still holding the heat of the day, and I stand there a minute. Somewhere out past the yard, there is a sound that is not jackals here. It is only the neighbor's air conditioner and farther off, the road. And I look up for a while, and then I come in, and the screen door does what screen doors do. And I go to bed.